This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/qualityculture. I think some of the most interesting discussions surrounding media, and perhaps some of the most polarizing, revolve around the concept of morally ambiguous characters. In most of the stories we consume, it's usually easy to surmise who's good or bad, to separate the heroes from the villains. Sure, our heroes may have flaws and make mistakes, but on a fundamental level we can say they're still good, even if it's deep down inside. But this simple act of categorizing gets a little trickier when you introduce characters with glaring ethical shortcomings or questionable pasts. As for the 2007 film Atonement, based on the 2001 novel by Ian McEwan, I think most people came away with the unwavering certainty that this kid really sucks. I'll get more into it soon, but due to a mix of unlucky circumstances and her own immaturity, 13-year-old Briony makes a series of horrible choices which irreversibly ruins the lives of two people. And it seems the essence of her character becomes a moral absolute for a lot of people watching. She is trash. She is irredeemable. This is partly because watching this film leaves you with a sense of overwhelming sorrow because of what she did. It's the kind of movie you might not want to watch twice, even though it really is gorgeous and well made. I think moral ambiguity is particularly relevant in our current cultural climate, where we're swift to pass judgment and reluctant to forgive, seemingly regardless of the severity of the transgression or how distant in the past. And it's becoming a little mind-boggling because pretty much everyone is morally ambiguous to a certain extent. Yet in all our online righteousness, we often dismiss context or nuance in favor of cramming people into the good or bad pile and treating them accordingly. But people are seldom as simple as that. Atonement is the perfect story to explore this topic, because what Briony did was terrible, but does this act have to define her forever? Did she ultimately atone for her wrongdoings? Did she grow as a person? Or is she truly irredeemable? And perhaps the most crucial question, who even gets to decide?
She's a nutter, man.
Yeah.
So, I don't forgive her. May she burn in hell.
So I gotta set the scene for what kind of kid Briony was. It's 1935 in England, and the first thing we know about her is she's a blossoming storyteller. One of my favorite details about the film is the use of a typewriter as an instrument in the score, highlighting the importance of writing as a motif. Briony's a really neat, orderly kid, and she uses writing to help solidify that sense of order. But she's on the cusp of young adulthood and trying to find new, less childish ways of telling stories. Like many 13-year-olds, she wants to seem more mature. She's also bored and isolated. Her father's always away and her mother's emotionally unavailable. Her older siblings are adults and have their own lives at university. So she's a bit lonely and attention-starved, but leads a relatively privileged life. There's another curious thing about Briony, and that's her relationship with empathy.
Do we have to do a play? Why do we have to?
For example, her cousins arrived for an extended stay because their parents were getting divorced, but Briony was pretty unconcerned. In the book, she considered the divorce a, quote, mundane unraveling that could not be reversed, and therefore offered no opportunities to the storyteller. It belonged in the realm of disorder. There's another scene where her cousin Lola was upset and crying, and Briony's thoughts mostly revolved around herself and her own sense of power in the situation.
How awful.
There's also a passage where she wonders about other people's experiences as humans. Was everyone else really as alive as she was? If the answer was yes, then the world, the social world, was unbearably complicated, with 2 billion voices, and everyone's thoughts striving in equal importance, and everyone's claim on life as intense, and everyone thinking they were unique when no one was. One could drown in irrelevance. But if the answer was no, then Briony was surrounded by machines, intelligent and pleasant enough on the outside, but lacking the bright and private inside feeling she had. This was sinister and lonely as well as unlikely, for though it offended her sense of order, she knew it was overwhelmingly probable that everyone else had thoughts like hers. She knew this, but only in a rather arid way. She didn't really feel it. I'm not gonna claim she's a sociopath or anything. I don't think it's uncommon to be so lost in your inner world that you forget other people have their own complex inner lives. But it does seem as though Briony treats this awareness of other people as something that can be disregarded, especially in the pursuit of writing. Nothing really mattered unless she could exploit it creatively.
An absolute egomaniac. I think that Briony is a young woman. She's a young girl, and all wee girls and wee boys are meant to be the centre of the universe. This is my theory, right? And it's your job to be the centre of the universe because it's the way you learn. And as you get older, you stop being so self-interested and you look out into the world and you become more interested in other people and other things, and that's how you then progress and become a more selfless human being and part of society.
And so this indifference, paired with her eagerness to create her own worlds, made it difficult for her to separate her storytelling fantasies from reality. Like when she was 9, she jumped into the river to see if Robbie, their maid's son, would save her from drowning. She did it for the drama of it all, hoping it would go something like the romance novels she'd been reading, where she'd profess her love to him and he to her. Obviously, it went nothing like that.
You could have killed us both! Is that your idea of a joke?
I want to thank you for saving my life. I will be eternally grateful to you.
But I think this scene shows just how wrapped up Briony had gotten in her fantasies.
She wasn't nasty. I don't think she was anything. Anyway, I think she was fiercely intelligent. I think, she's a child, especially in that sort of social situation, and at that time in England, children probably weren't really spoken to, you weren't really interacted with, and nobody except for James's character really truly interacts with her as a child. And so I think she's developed this overactive imagination, and unfortunately that gets them all into trouble.
So when we get to the vital scene by the fountain, where the misunderstandings all started and the horrible thing was set into motion, we have a better understanding of where Briony's head was at. She watched through the window as her sister Cecilia had a strange encounter with Robbie. In reality, they were just having miscommunication issues. Their lifelong connection was hampered by class differences, but they were in love and hadn't yet admitted it to each other or even to themselves. But as Briony watched them, the imaginative gears in her mind began turning. In the book, it's made clear she only thought about how this fountain incident could inspire a new story. Next, there was the letter. Oh man, the letter. Robbie wrote drafts of apologies to Cecilia for their argument at the fountain. And in a burst of emotion, or maybe just for a laugh, he wrote a pretty vulgar confession that he never meant to send. I don't think I've ever read such a poetic description of a swear word as in this book. The smooth, hollowed, partly enclosed forms of its first 3 letters were as clear as a set of anatomical drawings. 3 figures huddling at the foot of a cross. Because life is cruel, Robbie accidentally enclosed the vulgar letter instead of the proper one and handed it to Briony to give to Cecilia. By the time he realized his mistake, it was already too late. And of course, this nosy kid was gonna open the letter the first chance she got. She felt a mixture of emotions: disgust, protective of her sister, but most importantly, she had new inspiration for her mature story. It was wrong to open people's letters, but it was right. It was essential for her to know everything. With the letter, something elemental, brutal, perhaps even criminal had been introduced, some principle of darkness. And even in her excitement over the possibilities, she did not doubt that her sister was in some way threatened and would need her help. Robbie became a maniac in her mind. That's the word the book kept using, and that's the word she used to describe him to her cousin Lola.
Can I tell you something? Something really terrible. Yes, please.
Even in her desire to distance herself from the childish black and white of good and evil, Briony in her immaturity couldn't dream of a world past that. Robbie was a sex-crazed maniac, and the letter proved it. Some may say she was jealous because of her previous girlhood crush. And in my first watch of the film, I might have thought that had something to do with it. That she was bitter maybe, or wanted vengeance because he rejected her and chose her sister instead. But reading from Briony's point of view, it doesn't seem like that's the case, at least not consciously. She legit thought he was a lunatic, and she was determined to use this knowledge to her creative benefit. But wasn't she, that was Briony the writer, supposed to be so worldly now as to be above such nursery tale ideas as good and evil? There must be some lofty, godlike place from which all people could be judged alike, not pitted against each other as in some lifelong hockey match, but seen noisily jostling together in all their glorious imperfection. If such a place existed, she was not worthy of it. She could never forgive Robbie for his disgusting mind. Her worst fears came to fruition later that night when she walked in on Cecilia and Robbie in the library and witnessed what she assumed was a non-consensual encounter.
Cecilia,
And then finally, her twin cousins ran away from home, forcing everyone in the house to split up and search for them. This film expertly crafts the insidious reality of how small choices and mistakes can build up to ruinous events. What if Briony hadn't been by the window when Cecilia and Robbie had their initial argument? What if Robbie had sent the right letter? Or if Cecilia hadn't dropped her hair clip outside the library for her sister to take notice? If there was still a play for the twins to act in that night, maybe they wouldn't have run away. And then Briony, alone in the search party, wouldn't have come across Lola being sexually assaulted by a man Briony thought she recognized. All factors Briony must have turned over and over again in her head as she grew older, contemplating how things could have turned out differently. When Briony saw Lola's attacker, with all her newly formed fantasies that day, she came to the only conclusion that felt natural. It was Robbie, of course. Who else could it possibly be? As the book said, her eyes confirmed the sum of all she knew and had recently experienced. The truth was in the symmetry, which was to say, it was founded in common sense. The truth instructed her eyes, so when she said over and again, "I saw him," she meant it, and was perfectly honest as well as passionate.
Yes, I saw him.
Just as you see me.
I know it was him.
You know it was him? Well, you saw him.
This somewhat muddies the waters of our assessment of her wrongdoing. I feel it is important to consider that she thought she was telling the truth when she accused Robbie. Only 3 people at this point knew the real truth: Lola, Robbie, and the real attacker, Marshall. It doesn't make anything that happened okay. Not at all. But the accusation wasn't an act of malice on Briony's part, even if it may have appeared that way. The truth may seem obvious to us, but that's mostly because we're viewing scenes from multiple perspectives. She wasn't evil, she was confused, naive, stupid even. When she observed Robbie and Cecilia, she lacked context for what she was seeing and misconstrued the behaviors. It was outside the realm of her understanding, even though she thought it was within her grasp.
I wouldn't necessarily believe everything Briony tells you. She's rather fanciful.
Intent doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Like, if you did a bad thing, it happened and it sucks whether you meant it to or not. But I think intent does matter when we're judging character. There's a big difference between a Briony who's falsely accusing on purpose with malicious intent and a Briony who believes she's doing the right thing. But those muddy waters only get muddier when you consider that Briony pressured Lola to agree it was Robbie.
It was Robbie, wasn't it? Robbie?
In the same vein of some activists speaking over the people they're supposedly trying to help, Briony took over Lola's traumatic experience in a sense. Everything connected. It was her own discovery. It was her story, the one that was writing itself around her. She hardly let Lola speak for herself, if at all. She grabbed the reins from her and Lola let her take them, likely out of a reluctance to want to deal with it herself. In any case, this was Briony's big moment to shine. Finally, she could take the spotlight in this grown-up world, and what she said mattered to big important people. And so the fiction in Briony's mind at last played out in reality when she made her accusation. It was easy for them all to accept it and blame Robbie because he's just the cleaning lady's son. What makes it worse is Briony did start to have doubts at some point, but didn't want to change her mind and come off as a silly little girl who'd wasted everyone's time. The book notes, she would never be able to console herself that she was pressured or bullied. She never was. She trapped herself. She marched into the labyrinth of her own construction and was too young, too awestruck, too keen to please, to insist on making her own way back. She was not endowed with or old enough to possess such independence of spirit. An imposing congregation had massed itself around her first certainties, and now it was waiting and she could not disappoint it at the altar. Her doubts could be neutralized only by plunging in deeper.
I did, I saw him.
With your own eyes?
Yes. I saw him. I saw him with my own eyes.
Robbie was sentenced to prison and only released a few years later under the condition he'd enlist in the army during World War II. Meanwhile, Cecilia became a nurse and cut off contact with her family, living her life largely in isolation. So their lives were completely blown off course in the worst ways, especially Robbie's, who not only spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but then had to face the atrocities of war. Side note, but there's a 5-minute continuous shot when Robbie arrives at the beaches of Dunkirk for the evacuation, and it might be the most beautiful long take I've seen in a film. Okay, so we've established 13-year-old Briony as a bit of an egomaniac, but that leaves the question of whether she atoned for her mistakes or grew as a person. And I think an argument can be made for either conclusion, so I'll consider both possibilities. When Briony turned 18, instead of taking her spot at Cambridge as expected, she went into nursing training like her sister. She said in a letter to Cecilia that she wanted to make herself useful in a practical way, and Cecilia assumed she'd done it as an act of penance. Briony worked in the hospital under pretty harsh and horrific circumstances, while still writing at night, and she was evidently haunted by her mistake and wished she could make things right.
Robbie?
Towards the end of the film, we're given the impression that Robbie and Cecilia reunited. And they did meet once and made plans to see each other again before Robbie left for duty. That much is true.
Something to think of while you're away.
But there's also a scene where Briony visited Cecilia, apologized, and offered to rescind her statement to help clear Robbie's name. He happened to be there too.
5 years ago, you didn't care about telling the truth. All your family, you just assumed it. For all my education, I was still little better than a servant, still not to be trusted.
Importantly, Lola had just married Marshall, her attacker, so there was no avenue to seek real justice since spouses don't have to testify against each other. Still, things were looking up a bit for Robbie and Cecilia. They were deeply in love and might have had a chance to start anew when Robbie's service ended, especially if Briony helped undo the damage to his record and reputation.
Just do as we've asked of you. Write it all down, just the truth, no rhymes. No embellishments, no adjectives. And then leave us be.
We later learned that this part of the story, this whole meeting, was a fabrication. In reality, and this is the final gut punch of the film, Robbie had died from an infected wound weeks earlier at Dunkirk, on the last day of the evacuation. And Briony said she was too much of a coward to actually visit Cecilia, who soon died during the Blitz. Their love story never quite got its satisfying closure. They became casualties of war like so many others.
My sister and Robbie were never able to have the time together. Ever since, I've always felt I prevented.
We learned this at the end of the movie through 77-year-old Briony, who's now an accomplished novelist and had been writing different drafts of this autobiographical story for decades. At this final stage in her life, and with newly diagnosed dementia, she made up a new ending for Robbie and Cecilia.
I wanted to give Robbie and Cecilia what they lost out on in life.
Briony felt that the real story, which she still openly admitted to, would offer nothing but hopeless cynicism to the world. In the book, she says, how could that constitute an ending? What sense of hope or satisfaction could a reader draw from such an account? Who would want to believe that they never met again, never fulfilled their love? Who would want to believe that except in the service of the bleakest realism? I couldn't do it to them. I'm too old, too frightened, too much in love with the shred of life I have remaining. I face an incoming tide of forgetting, and then oblivion. I no longer possess the courage of my pessimism.
I'd like to think this isn't weakness or evasion, but a final act of kindness. I gave them their happiness.
This is where opinions on Briony's morality and motivations really start to diverge. I think it's understandable to most people that 13-year-old Briony was just a naive child who made a terrible mistake, but many people can't reconcile with old Briony's choices, since it seems she may not have evolved from her childhood ego. After all, isn't she still using other people's lives for her writing? Isn't she just manipulating the story for her own benefit to alleviate her guilt? To say she's giving them their happiness does sound rather arrogant. She couldn't give them their happiness any more than she could raise them from the dead.
I think as she carries on and she gets older, she remains just as mental.
Yeah.
I don't think she progresses like any other human being. I think she stays completely in the centre. And
It is
I don't
very
think
much writer is God.
Yeah,
isn't it?
totally. There used to be a line in the film, which was too much. It's in the book, where it says, so you feel like you've been forgiven? She says, no, because there is no forgiveness for God. He says, as a writer, you are a kind of God. And you just think, she's a nutter, man.
Yeah.
So I don't forgive her. May she burn in hell.
Okay, so James McAvoy is talking about this passage from the book. The problem these 59 years has been this. How can a novelist achieve atonement when, with her absolute power of deciding outcomes, she is also God? There is no one, no entity or higher form that she can appeal to, or be reconciled with, or that can forgive her. There is nothing outside her. In her imagination, she has set the limits and the terms. No atonement for God or novelists, even if they are atheists. It was always an impossible task, and that was precisely precisely the point. The attempt was all. Okay, I get why James thinks this sounds egotistical. It does come off a bit deranged, but I'm inclined to interpret it a different way. I think she's saying it's impossible for her to achieve atonement through this novel because she's the one who chose what happens in it. She doesn't get to decide whether she's forgiven. It's an impossible task. There's no one left to appeal to, just as God has no one above him to appeal to. Even in her altered story, she deliberately withheld Robbie and Cecilia's forgiveness from herself. The two people who could offer her forgiveness are long gone, so the attempt to atone is all she can extend. For her, this is what an attempt looks like when the obvious options are no longer possible.
I mean, how does anyone get forgiven anything? I mean, I suppose that's what I really want to say. You could have someone forgive you. A strange process that when they say, I forgive you. But what actually happens? The deed remains, the thing you did. You can never call it back. Is the ending positive? It is in this sense that she has made the massive lifelong effort to confront a mistake. She committed a great error. I don't think of it as a crime, but many readers do. She's committed a great error, and she has spent many decades examining it. And finally, to have a moral conscience, to live an examined life, to be as aware in your thoughts as you possibly can with the gift of consciousness you have, is my sense of, asserting what it is to be on the side of life.
So Briony was seeking atonement in the only way she knew how. She sees the novel as a representation and preservation of Cecilia and Robbie's love for each other. In this form, it would be eternal, and sometimes fabrications can be mercies, like when Briony worked as a nurse during the war and lied to comfort a dying soldier. In therapy and support groups, when you've made a mistake and can't make amends for whatever reason, you're eventually encouraged to begin the process of forgiving yourself, even though it may feel self-serving. Self-compassion, after acknowledging our faults, helps us grow as people. Briony had been carrying shame for over 60 years, for something she did as a naive kid. As the book says, how guilt refined the methods of self-torture, threading the beads of detail into an eternal loop. A rosary to be fingered for a lifetime. The truth of the matter is, nothing she's capable of would ever actually be enough to atone for her mistake, to assuage that guilt. And at some point, suffering and remorse serves no purpose. So maybe her change to the story was an act of compassion for herself too, but maybe that's not so terrible. She would be dying from dementia soon. Maybe it was time for her to put the guilt to rest, to approach the end of life in peace. Personally, I'm in the camp of maybe just leave well enough alone. But I can understand why she felt she had to get the story out there. And not just for herself, but for Robbie and Cecilia's legacy. I can empathize with her plight even if I don't endorse her actions. And I think that's the major takeaway of morally ambiguous characters. They demand evaluation, reflection, and as a result, hopefully we start to consider real-life people with the same level of empathy and nuance. When we approach topics like atonement or accountability, we need to examine what that means in a tangible sense, or else we're just propping up vague notions of retributive justice. Through writing novels, Briony sought to consider experiences from other people's perspectives. Looking through the window all those years ago, that world of nuance finally opened up to her. She could write the scene 3 times over from 3 points of view. Her excitement was in the prospect of freedom, of being delivered from the cumbrous struggle between good and bad, heroes and villains. None of these 3 were bad, nor were they particularly good. She need not judge. There did not have to be a moral. She need only show separate minds, as alive as her own, struggling with the idea that other minds were equally alive. It wasn't only wickedness and scheming that made people unhappy. It was confusion and misunderstanding. Above all, it was the failure to grasp the simple truth that other people are as real as you. And only in a story could you enter these different minds and show how they had an equal value. That was the only moral a story need have. I'd love to know what other characters or stories you think explore moral ambiguity well. I personally want to recommend a film that's streaming on Mubi right now. It's probably not what you expect. Mubi is a curated streaming service, a place to watch beautiful, interesting, incredible cinema. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. So I recently watched Battle Royale for the first time. Iconic Japanese film, kind of a precursor for dystopian stories like The Hunger Games or Squid Game. And obviously because of its premise, I think it's an interesting exploration into moral ambiguity. A class of teenagers are brought to a deserted island and have to kill each other until they're the last one standing. Pretty different tone and scenario for these kids than Briony, I know, but super enthralling and memorable. I think this kind of story explores our sense of morality on like a primal level. Some real Lord of the Flies type stuff. Like, are you gonna hang on to your principles or just do what you have to do to survive? If you want to check out Battle Royale or the hundreds of other great films Mubi has to offer, you can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/qualityculture. That's mubi.com/qualityculture for a whole month of great cinema for free. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!